I wanted to profile a project coming out of France and Europe called ROMI, which is Robotics for Microfarms. And, here in North America, the word microfarm is actually kind of new. I mean, for a farm like ours, where we're relatively small, most Canadians, most North Americans would refer to it as a hobby farm. And the idea is that if you have a small farm, it's more like a hobby because larger farmers just don't take you seriously. And I kind of find that insulting because, no one would actually run a farm as a hobby. Now, maybe they would run a farm that doesn't generate a lot of revenue or that they wouldn't depend upon as their primary income. But I don't think any farmer runs their farm as a hobby. And that's why the word microfarm makes more sense. And it also speaks to how microfarms have different technological needs, different budgets, different resources that they could afford. So this was an interesting project that I learned about via the International Forum of Agricultural Robotics, in that the ROMI project was one of the sponsors of the International Forum of Agricultural Robotics. And ROMI stands for Robotics for Microfarms. ROMI is a 4-year Europe-funded research project committed to promoting a sustainable, local, and human-scale form of agriculture. It's developing an affordable multi-purpose platform that's adapted to support organic and polyculture market garden farms. And, Europe is really big into this, in part because they want to be self-sustainable. They don't want to have to import food from the United States or from other producing regions. But Europe also is a little more advanced when it comes to valuing organic produce or discouraging the use of harmful pesticides and chemicals. And part of that can be accomplished when you have smaller farms, when you have micro farms, because that then allows farmers to take greater responsibility for the way in which they produce their crops or their livestock. And they can also put in greater care and greater responsiveness so that they don't have to rely upon chemicals or pesticides. But with that said, it still can be very difficult for organic or micro farmers to make a living because they're not operating at the same scale of larger farms or larger agricultural operations. And that's why robotics has tremendous potential to transform organic farming as we know it and empower a new wave of micro farmers who don't have the money, who don't have the resources or the inherited wealth of traditional farmers, but they still do have an interest in contributing to the agricultural sector and using the internet as a source of knowledge, as a source of innovation for them to learn more and engage in general. Now, ROMI has a range of robotic projects. I mean, kind of like Twisted Fields, they're still in their early days. They're still dealing with prototypes, but nonetheless, these tools have tremendous potential. Whether that's a drone that can do scanning, whether that's the way in which they can build open source field data or do modeling in terms of plant analysis, which is a future topic we'll get into in terms of another free and open source project called Open Drone Map. But it also looks at the way in which farming communities and microfarm communities are the basis of a kind of mutual support or a shared resources, especially when it comes to technology. And that's part of why ROMI is more than just developing technology. It's about developing resources and developing shared resources. Now, ironically, Sony CSL is one of the leaders in what they call the P2P Food Lab or the peer-to-peer food lab, which sort of reflects the free and open source tools that they're using. And it's part of how they develop their Robotics for Microfarms project, which is kind of the core of what's happening with ROMI. Part of that, as mentioned, is imaging. But the head of Sony CSL in France is a researcher, Peter Hanap. And Peter Hanap is working in the P2P Food Lab, and he's partly developed the weeding robot, which is one of the cores of ROMI. And the weeding robot is similar to what we saw in Acorn in that it's basically an autonomous robot that drives up a crop field and it uses AI imaging analysis to identify plants and then use a blade to cut weeds. So it knows which plants are desirable, it knows which plants are not desirable, and rather than having to spray a herbicide to kill those plants, it just uses a knife. It just acts as like a lawnmower and cuts that weed down, allowing the plants you desire to overtake the weeds. And so this is what would, in theory, allow for organic farming to scale, because you're using robots to handle weeds rather than chemicals, which then allows for organic farming practices without the labor-intensive practices and potentially at much greater scale, because these robots could run all the time. I mean, granted, the solar power robots can't run when the sun isn't out, but they have batteries that allow them to charge up and allow them to keep going when it's dark or when the sun is not out. And that, I think, creates a whole range of opportunities when it comes to the scale in which these types of robots and these types of farms can operate. So just like Twisted Acorn, the ROMI project is still in development, and it's something that we're keeping a close watch on. But it does speak to exciting potential when it comes to open source agriculture and the way in which this knowledge is being shared openly. And that is a real contrast in terms of contemporary farming versus antiquity farming. Because historically, farmers were very cooperative, right? Neighbors helped each other. They shared tools. They shared knowledge. They shared ideas. And that is a real ethic that unfortunately has been lost in the wave of kind of big business and big tech in agriculture.